Thank you all for your determination to be here at such an early hour, and it's good, and I guess you beat the traffic to be here on time. And so we'll stick to our program and our timetable. And we have an hour, which is not too much, especially because we have enough very impressive panel of speakers and experts. The topic itself is fascinating. I guess it lends itself for a much longer conversation. It's about finance and innovation. I guess in the context of the annual investment meeting, obviously the role of finance is so crucial because on the one hand, the finances and financial services is one of the areas which are experiencing the fastest growth in terms of international investment, with a lot of uncertainty surrounding it, including Brexit and many other phenomena, but still it's a very buoyant area of international investment. At the same time, obviously international investment only happens if finance is available. So international investment is both a protagonist and a facilitator of international investment. In this ecosystem, you see the increasing role of innovation which has different phases. One is the technological aspect of it, and some of the speakers here are uniquely positioned to give their thought on this. Another one is the regulatory environment and the role that it can play both in promoting innovation, but also, unfortunately, sometimes stifling innovation, but also the responsibilities of course. The role of entrepreneurs, and again, we hear from some companies which are very recent and very still, I guess, born again startups. And obviously, the role of Dubai in this and the UAE more generally is crucial to this. So, without further ado, and again, knowing that we have little time and that the person who will be interested, we will definitely be interested in hearing from you. Also, your experiences and your questions and answers. And also the fact that we have to beat the noise from outside, so we have to speak a little louder than usual. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to our guest and panelists. And I suggest they all have fascinating careers and lives, and we discovered that we all spent at least a few years in at least 3 countries, I guess, each of us, so as I'm sure you did. And so I won't spend too much time introducing each of them, but giving mostly an introduction to their current title. And I suggest that we start from Jennifer. Jennifer is Executive Vice President and Global Head of Sales Strategy and Execution at Saxo Markets. And I think it's a good way of starting because she can present the experience of Saxo and the way slightly less than 25 years, it has grown from, I guess, a small Danish operation into a global pocket multinational, as we like to call them in Italy. Jennifer.
Original fintech firms before there was even a word for it. So just for context, just 2 sentences. What Saxo really does is provide banking infrastructure and technology infrastructure to banks, brokers, and wealth managers who are trying to digitize. And we do this across all jurisdictions. So one of the things that we're seeing right now is just a massive shift for the financial services sector to have a digital strategy and really think about the next generation of clients whose digital preferences are quite different than the generation before. And the Middle East specifically is very well poised for this fintech revolution, so to speak, just based on the demographics, a very young population, as well as the mobile and internet penetration. However, there's still a kind of significant underinvestment in the fintech as a sector compared to US or China, and that's starting to change. But what we're really seeing is a deep interest across the entire financial services sector to unbundle the customer journey and pick pieces of it to own and pieces of it to outsource. And we're seeing that across the Middle East from Oman, Jordan, Bahrain, Dubai, and everybody's trying to get their arms around some kind of digital innovation path.
What's the role that you have here in Dubai? What's the role that your office in Dubai is playing?
We have had an office in Dubai for many years, and we do 2 things here. We work with retail investors who simply want to access global markets in a digital digital way. And then we work with institutions, mostly banks, brokers, and wealth managers who want to own the customer journey, own the interaction with clients, but might not want to continue investing or can't continue investing in keeping up with the technology platform and all that that requires from financial instruments to regulatory compliance.
You touched on the role of the Middle East in the global scene of fintech and for financial innovation. There are very important issues from the point of view of regulation. And I'd like Wayne Loom, who is Executive Director, Capital Markets and the Financial Services Regulatory Authority for the Abu Dhabi Global Markets, to tell us a bit more about what are the priorities, especially in this very complex world where you have innovations, which by definition regulators cannot know too much about. At the same time, you have increasing risks and especially when it comes to security of financial flows, the role of the UAE markets is crucial.
Right. Thanks for having me. I perhaps would give a high-level introduction as to how ADGM approaches innovation, why we are doing that. Okay, sorry. Yeah. So ADGM was created with the objective of supporting UAE with the creation of an international financial center. And if you think about it, until recently, most of the investors around this region don't really have much of a choice other than go overseas to carry out their financial activities. So a lot more intermediation and transactions can be anchored in UAE. And with that, with the ADGM as well as the DFC, these are options and platforms for investors to now bring some of those investments and anchor it back into ADGM. So we went on with the objective to develop a world-class regulatory framework to support the business needs of the local community, as well as international investors coming to invest into this region to hub their activities from this region. Now, fintech is a very important component of that because fintech promotes the growth of financial services sector. And financial services sector is not just an engine of growth on its own. It also supports the development of the other economic sectors. So financial services is a key pillar for any economy. Now in this digital economy, we adopt the philosophy that we have to embrace innovation. Innovation is really at our doorstep. It's a question of whether you make a choice now or later. You can close the door and ignore it altogether, but when you open the door, it's going to be there again. So as a regulator, we think we can play a very active, innovative role to supporting financial innovation. So what we did was, in March, we announced that we want to create a platform to support fintech players in this region. And we went around the world to visit the various stakeholders from UK, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, Australia, US. And we talked to many stakeholders and find out what is needed to create such a platform. So with all the consultation, we went live with our regulatory sandbox, which we call the Regulatory Laboratory, or RegLab in short, in November last year. The RegLab is actually a platform that allows fintech players to test and develop their ideas without being subject to the full suite of regulatory requirements, and to allow them to operate in a safe environment such that when they fail safely without impact to the wider financial services system. So we're happy that we launched it in November, and we closed our first batch of application in November this year. So we received about 11 applications, one from UK, US, Singapore, 3 from India, 1 from Egypt, and a few from the region. So we are looking at that batch of applicants now, and hopefully in a couple of weeks or so, we'll be able to admit them onto our platform for them to test and innovate their ideas. And hopefully with that, they're able to interact with the financial services, financial institutions to offer these solutions to the wider market.
Bring insights and accelerate the value that their data brings to the front end and their business processes. Now, I'm going to be provocative regarding the role that we see of fintechs in financial services. And it's about accelerating or changing the rules of the game for some specific business processes that perhaps banks have not been properly in addressing or have lacked interest or focus on. So think on this. These fintechs are bringing something different that banks have there. And behind that value proposition are insights. And the insights are driven by thinking how they are going to deliver that value. So what we do at IBM is we do three things at a gross level. The first thing that we do is we bring new ways of looking at the business problem. We look at component business model and design thinking to really address that need at the end user level or at the customer level. The second thing that we do is we help companies to bring a value proposition around their digital intelligence. And that digital intelligence is made by the data or the insight from the data that they have inside the organization, plus the insights that are coming from outside their firewalls. And you call it big data, but for me, it's not about the big data, it's about that nugget of critical information in that big amount of information that makes relevant for a particular transaction at a particular customer at a particular moment. And that requires a changing in paradigms how we look at this. So that's the second big thing, is how to help companies to leverage their digital intelligence as a competitive advantage. And the third thing is a foundational thing, which is how to enable these companies from a foundational level to manage their data assets properly. And we look at the frontiers of big insights and cognitive. However, underneath, if you go to any organization, you realize that their data governance, their data management, their data quality may not be at the right level. And sadly enough, some of the organizations in financial services, when you say data governance, they believe that this is an IT topic, and it's actually a business topic. So that is part of what we do at IBM from an information management perspective.
We heard, thanks Olga, we heard about the great entrepreneurial spirits, we heard about the great role that regulators can play, we heard about the companies that are more than 100 years old that are reinventing themselves. This is great, but what if cybersecurity isn't there?
I think one of the key aspects for the success of fintech and the digital transformation itself is the assurance that you could give to people that these systems are secure and the information is private. I mean, the privacy will play a big role in the success of this rapid adoption of fintech as well as digital transformation. Well, what we do at CISO Connect is being a CISO, which is Chief Information Security Officer with various Dubai and Abu Dhabi governments in the last 15 years. We started off, I felt the need of having a community of security professionals who could talk to each other, who could share their experiences, and that's how the CISO Council and CISO Connect was born. So what we do at CISO Connect is connect the global cybersecurity executives to talk to each other, to discuss their pain points, and share information from their experiences in terms of what succeeded and what failed, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you want to do something important. So one of the key aspects of why cybersecurity would play a very important role is because digital is complex. It sounds simple, but it's very complex. It's quite sophisticated, and people are rushing to adopt digital without keeping the security and privacy in mind, because otherwise they'll run out of business and they'll run out of market. The next most important aspect is the regulatory framework. The regulators and the policy makers are not up to the pace of the digital transformation itself. So that could be another challenge that you could face. And having said that, if you look at the GDPR, which is the Global Data Protection Regulation that is coming out of the EU, this is for the first time a regulatory framework will be released in EU but will be enforced globally, which has not happened in the past. So if any company in any country dealing with the data of EU citizen has to comply with it, the penalties are huge. You're talking about up to 4% of your revenues, which could be your penalties. So these things are sort of getting serious across the world, and cybersecurity, like I said, would be one of the key game-changing factors for companies to be the winners among the various competitors that they would have.
Thanks a lot, Ahmed. Coming back to you, Jennifer, the regulatory issue seems to be crucial. We heard that mentioned by many of you, and obviously what is crucial here is to make sure that there are global rules for fair dealing and compliance in an environment which is global and is born global. In other sectors, there were national regulations that then were made coherent by international cooperation. In this case, everything is happening at the same time. So global regulation is taking shape as we speak. And what, from your perspective, are the main priorities, and are regulators working to that effect?
So I'd like to echo some of the thoughts that we're getting into now, which is there's no doubt that the complexity of the regulatory environment is increasing, but that everyone is starting to move in the same direction. It's about transparency, consumer protection, fair dealing, and what you're starting to see is more active regulatory involvement in setting the framework to start with, and much more collaboration across borders than we've seen in the past, and frankly, leadership from regulators to define that ecosystem going forward. Because to echo your point, you know, as the world starts to, or as the financial services industry starts to unbundle, you suddenly have a much more complex perimeter to think about. You know, the prior world where everything was proprietary and you could work within your own borders as a company is not viable for the fast innovation we need in the new digital economy. But to do that really introduces some very complex security and regulatory concerns, because as your perimeter increases, you know, how do you manage that? And I think we'll see a lot more discussion about the security implications and regulatory implications as this sector matures. Right now, most of the media focus is just on the sheer beauty of the customer experiences that are starting to enter the market. But the devil is in the detail, and as this ecosystem develops, you'll see much more, I think, regulatory harmony in terms of some of the key themes, and focus on how do you manage a much more open perimeter, which is not a trivial task, as you have highlighted.
Thanks a lot. Wei Lum, you originally come from Singapore, which has had an enormous development of the fintech sector, very much led by the state in its different incarnations, including that of as a regulator. Of course, the private sector is buoyant in Singapore, but as we know that the state is always present, that there is a real industrial policy, even in the case of the financial industry, that most of the larger financial institutions are government-linked companies. So how do you see this ecosystem evolving in Singapore, and what kind of lessons can you draw for Abu Dhabi in particular, but more generally for the Gulf region? I mean, can that kind of experience be replicated, or is it very sui generis and peculiar to Singapore?
Right. I think there are a lot of lessons that we can draw all over the world, and interestingly, each of the practices adopted by each of the jurisdictions differ according to their context. So in Singapore's case, there's a very much kind of a government-led coordinated approach to bring the various players together. And I think that has been a strength in their policy. So the policymakers are able to bring the various players together, starting from the academics to the technology firms, to the VC investors, to the institutional investors, to the financial institutions in terms of deploying that fintech product. Now that said, if you look at the US model, they also thrive without having the kind of government-led initiative. And that's simply because they have a very strong bottom-up initiative. So places like even UK, US, US is the extreme in the sense that everything is bottom-up. Right? The regulators are so hands-off that in fact some of the players are asking or screaming for the regulators to step in to give some guidance. And US is a bit behind the curve in that sense, and they're only starting to look at the issue now. In UK, you get a better mix of bottom-up and the regulator giving the guidance. And Singapore is a step further to the left in terms of a government interventionist approach, which is similar to what probably the Australians are doing. In Abu Dhabi's case, our financial system and sector is definitely less developed compared to these international financial centers. So we think that we need to play an active role in bringing the various players together. So the regulatory framework, rules and regulations is what we are good at in terms of putting in place, but I think it goes beyond rules and regulations as far as this part of the world is concerned. We need to step in to help develop the ecosystem, which includes tying up with the universities, the local universities here, to get them to understand that whatever curriculum they develop will contribute to the development of the pipeline for the fintech sector in the future. We work with accelerators to help the startup community commercialize their ideas to concepts to the markets. We work with co-working spaces to make sure that there is a cost-effective solution for them to work and interact with their network. We work with technology firms. IBM is one of them, Temenos, so on and so forth. So all of them provides the kind of digital infrastructure for the startup community to plug and play. And finally, financial institutions, as far as I see, are the most important stakeholders in this whole ecosystem, because they are the people who has they are the institutions that has the trust of the investors here, right? If you go to the streets, I think most of them would say, I'd rather put the money in the bank than someone else, right? So the reality here is that the customer base of the banks are very much banking centric. So for us to go the pure disruption mode is not going to fly from day one. We need to make sure that the banks get to understand fintech, work together with the startup community to start moving and evolving their business models to embrace innovation in a bigger way. So I think that's probably where UAE needs to adopt, or rather that's the approach that UAE has to take, as opposed to what you see in the other international jurisdictions.
Thanks a lot. Now, what is interesting about, again, I'm saying something banal, but what is interesting about the world we live in is that maybe the world is not flat, but certainly compared to 10 or 20 years ago when innovation was mostly in the north and adoption was in the south, now we see a lot of innovation in the global south, I mean, which is very well exemplified by the cases of Singapore and Dubai. But we also see innovation in the real south in a way. Privileged to have Olga, who spent time in Kenya, and I cannot resist the temptation of asking her about one particular case of fintech, which may be a low-tech fintech in a way compared to other examples, which is the very fast adoption of mobile banking and the leapfrogging that banking has made over traditional banking in Kenya, a place where you spent a few years. So what, again, it's not so much about drawing lessons, which is somehow a misnomer, but it's about understanding how experiences in some countries can have implications, at least, if not lessons, for other countries.
I think that you are referring about Safaricom and M-Pesa, correct? So I have been a banker or in banking for the last 23 years. Been in several countries and live and experience what banks means for the economy. In my opinion, and it's a very personal opinion, in Kenya, the banking system is one of the, I'm going to say, weakest worldwide. And the reason is this situation that happened 15 years ago, and this is a story that I'm going to make very short. 15 years ago, the banks in Kenya were very selective about to whom were they targeting to provide banking services. And they abandoned the lower level of the population. And they forgot that Kenya is an actually rural economy. So people leave their hometowns to go and work in the city, and they need to send back money to support their families back home. They leave that gap. And that gap was filled by someone that came and said, I can help you send money back home, and that was a telco. Fantastic business. Today, this telco managed close to between 30 to 35% of the GDP of the country. It is a fantastic story, but let's step back from a banking perspective. Who loans money to a small business? Who loans money for personal uses or for a mortgage? It are the banks. So, and what is the business of banks? There is a lot of income that comes from payment transactions. So when you look at and combine this, yes, a need for the population was addressed, but in the bigger scheme of things, there is a gap regarding funding the economy. So I look at this as a good fintech example from a services perspective, but I also have a question mark regarding the role of the regulators around managing and balancing the need for a solid financial system that supports the economy and the needs for the country. And I think that I'm going to leave this as a question mark regarding when you embrace, not just from a regulation perspective, from a capabilities perspective, all of what the fintechs are bringing, the regulators need to be careful.
Left in a corner of the room, considered as the techies and not very implicated in all the other discussions about business systems, about customer protection, about financial regulation.
I think basically I would take 3 points here. The first point is, at least from this region perspective, when you look at UAE, it's more of government-driven innovation. So when they want companies and organizations to innovate, one of the key aspects that they also look at, what kind of growth is required from the regulatory perspective. So at least from UAE perspective, I think it's pretty well covered. I'm not sure there are a lot of, like banking here is considered as a critical infrastructure like everywhere else. So we do have NISA regulations, which is from the federal government. We have state level regulations in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, which are enforced on the banking system and the other technology, fintech kind of companies. Now there's a very close relationship here, and also the banking community here has their own forum where they meet on a monthly basis. And the good thing about this is, unlike past, the security people are not left alone, and they never had a boardroom seat. If you could have looked back a few years, I don't think any of the security person or the chief of security would have had access to the board of directors or the CEOs. But in my past role, in last couple of years, I had almost a monthly presentation to the CEO and the director general of the companies where I was working. Now that is a big change. Now that's not still everywhere. I would say probably there's around 20% coverage. There's still 80% to be covered there. Not all companies give access to security people, but who's to be blamed? I mean, if you look at the typical role of people managing security and the regulatory framework or compliance, in most companies are the techies. Security is not a technical problem. Let me make it clear. The moment you think that security is a technical problem, that is the first problem that you have to solve even before security. Security is a business issue now, and fintech and digital will make it a more prominent thing about it, because everything that you do, central nervous system of your organization is digital. The information that you collect, the information that you process, the transactions that you process, everything is happening on systems now. The fraud management, so which means the IT or the CIO of the company and the CISO or the chief security officer of the company has to have access to the key business people, especially the board and the CEOs, because if they don't have access to the executive management, probably their message will never be conveyed, and the management will never have awareness about what could be the impact of a business. I'll just give you a recent example. The Yahoo deal, just because of the data breach, the deal came down to almost 350 million less than what it was originally planned. So Verizon had planned to take it at a particular figure, and just because of 2 continuous breaches, the value came down by almost 350 or 400 million. So that is the kind of impact we're talking about. So it is a serious thing that all kind of organizations, not just fintech, should be looking at. The government will play a very important role, because the government cannot wait till an incident happens to bring out a regulation, and you cannot make it too enforced. Like there are a lot of countries which has too many regulations to deal with. Even that is not good, because there has to be a balance between the business and the regulatory framework, because you cannot have too many regulations, because then the business will have another headache to deal with instead of focusing on the key components. So working together is very important there.
Working together, exactly. I mean, which leads us to the issue of collaboration, not only between banks and other among banks, but also between banks and other stakeholders. I'd like Jennifer to develop this further, especially in the context of the complexity that we have seen associated to the fintech revolution. And how do you assess from your position and from the fact that you have experience in other regions, especially in Europe, of course, since you are based in Denmark, how do you see the level of collaboration that banks are engaging in this area?
So, you know, that is the big theme right now, but to be a little bit provocative, I would say we're not collaborating enough with enough urgency. So the whole genesis of this transformation we're going through really started with new entrants coming in a digital way and creating nice customer experience that really resonated with clients in a way that was very different than what had been delivered by banks in the past. And then as that matured and we kind of got into the second wave of fintech, banks started thinking about collaborating with outside providers in a more aggressive and radical way. But if you take it one step further, you know, a lot of where this trend is coming from is actually from other industries. It's the consumer giants, you know, Facebook, Alibaba, Amazon, etc., where we live a good portion of our lives and who are quite advanced at thinking about open architecture and open API and how to collaborate in a very open platform environment. So when we're very privileged to work across lots and lots of banks around the world, and all of them say we want to innovate faster, create unique customer journeys using big data, etc. But when you get into the detail of it, it is really about aligning within your own organization and working with the CEO and the CTO and the head of sales to think about how would I even do this? How would I unbundle my value proposition and then rebundle it? And if there's one pain point we see in working across lots of organizations, there's certainly the will to do this, but to execute on that really takes a lot of cohesiveness across all parts of the organization to think about, okay, what part of the journey are we good at? What do we want to own? What do we want to outsource? How would we take this apart and build it in a different way? And that's some of the real pain points that I think delay projects quite a bit, which is the need to innovate is there, the desire to innovate is there, but it really requires a lot of cross-departmental collaboration to execute a different way of doing business. And that is deeper involvement with the regulatory departments, security, sales, etc. And I think we're not doing it fast enough as an industry. And you're already seeing the lines between industries being blurred. You know, Alibaba and Amazon are quite good at making loans to their small businesses in their marketplace, which is both a threat to traditional banks as well as fintech entrants. And you know, they've developed that and they do quite a good job of it. And so if anything, I think we have a really narrow window to collaborate within our own ecosystem of fin and tech to get this right.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that it's all about a trial and error, as it is always the case with innovation. And it would be fantastic to do some trial before making the errors. And voila, the Abu Dhabi global market has developed the first fintech regulatory laboratory framework in the region. So I don't know whether you knew about Jennifer's point, but certainly you preempted her in a way because you have it. Can you explain us a bit more what is this about and how it's panning out?
Yeah, certainly. I think even as a regulator, the Reg Lab to us is a very exciting project because this is like almost our first attempt at trying to embrace innovation. Right. So the idea is that we adopt a blank sheet approach to regulating these fintech startups. Now, what does that mean? It means that as a startup coming in, we disapply all the rules that are applicable to you from day one. Right? We look at your business model and we identify a few key risk areas. From there, we impose and customize a regulatory framework to address those specific needs and specific risks. So if you are a startup community, if you are a fintech player, maybe all you need to remember are just 5 rules, right? But with less rules, it means that there's a greater chance of it being, there's a greater chance of it going wrong, there's a greater chance of it failing, there's a greater chance of it impacting the wider system. So what we did is, while we have fewer rules, we put it into an environment where their clientele reach and the impact on the market is limited. So we do have to curtail a bit of their market, their business reach and their business model, so that they don't access the wider market in a bigger way. Right. So you are given, as a startup community, as a fintech player, you are given 2 years to try your product. And if you successfully launch a product within a certain segment of the market, you are then allowed to test it in the wider market. Now, when you scale your business and accordingly, that's where we will step up our regulatory requirements accordingly. To us, that is a good balance, because we start off regulation proportional to your scale and business, so that you can try from day one, as opposed to being subject to all the rules and you will fail because the regulatory burden is too much. Right? And as you gain success and traction, that's where we start to apply the tap. We turn on the regulations accordingly, so that you can be ready for the real, or you're ready for the rough and tumble of the financial services sector, right? Where you need to think about how to make sure your investors' interests are safeguarded. How do you make sure that whatever you do is in the interest of the customers? How do you make sure you comply with all the AML, CFT requirements, so on and so forth, right? So it is a platform that works both ways, not just for the fintech player to develop the product. It's also a platform for us to learn, so that we know how do we update our rules so that they are relevant to this digital economy, right? So it makes sense. We develop rules that make sense to this digital economy going forward, as opposed to something which predates the handphone.
Thank you. Now, experiments sometimes are made in laboratories, and some other times are made in the open air. And we heard about a fintech experiment in a way with the mobile banking, but again, drawing on your experience, Olga, and the fact that you originally hailed from Colombia. Colombia and the rest of Latin America have been at the forefront of the pension fund revolution. And we know how important long-term investors are. We know from this part of the world how important sovereign wealth funds are in promoting the development of the financial industry. And but again, Latin America has a different experience with long-term investors, with pension funds. And how do you assess that experience? What are the strengths and the weaknesses, if any?
So just to level set, let me brief you in what the pension fund revolution was in Latin America. It means funding that needs to be back to the hands of the owners in a 30-year or 35-year period. That's funding. And the difference from pension funds in Latin America versus Canada or the US, which you have the 401k or the RRSPs, is that there is a regulation framework that guarantees a minimum return of investment, a minimum. And if the managing of the funds cannot provide that, that guarantee, they need to put it back from their own pocket. So they ensure that those funds are properly managed. That experiment has really bring money back to the economy in a way in which these pension funds are now funding most of the infrastructure projects of the country. Most of the financial services are backed up by these pension funds, and you can see the benefits that they have provided in the growth of, Chile, Peru, Argentina, and the average returns of these funds are 7% devaluation, minus devaluation. So what it means is really a tremendous engine for the economy. From a fintech perspective, and I'm going to bring this was a pre-fintech term, but it really drove a change in the mindset of people. First, the government recognized that they were not the proper pension fund administrator, and they needed to concede and accept that they were going to give this money to the private sector to be managed. Rule number one. Rule number two, they put a framework that ensured that that money was going to be protected. So if you go to the US, and if I am a contributor there, I can give money to any type of investment. It could be a hedge fund, and I can lose that money tomorrow. In Latin America, they said we cannot gamble with the pension money. We need to ensure that at a minimum, the money is preserved. So that is it was a big step, and it had several enemies when they were debated, but it has really bring value to the economy from that, safety perspective. And rule number 3, it brought education to the people. Now everybody knows what is happening with their money. And from a financial education perspective, having a population that understands how their money is being managed, it brings a different level of discussion.
Fantastic. Ahmed, before we open the floor to some questions and answers, or at least to the questions, I don't know whether we will have the answers. I guess over the past few weeks, the GCC has been under the spotlight from a security perspective because of these concerns which has led the US, Australia, and the UK to impose a ban on PC and other hardware flying on. So do you think this is changing somehow the debate? Is not so much specific to fintech, this question, but since you are an expert on security issues and cyber security issues, is this changing the terms of the debate? Do you think that there is a risk of a backlash which would extend to the fintech industry, or this is very specific and will be solved and what the government is already doing will be sufficient?
I think you just put me on spot. I'll just answer this in a very simple way. See, most of the governments are getting more protectionist. Okay, they want to sort of save their interests. They want to make sure that there's enough ways of getting the economy run and all that. But you cannot just. I think probably it's too difficult, in my personal opinion, to make any comment on that. It might be a security issue, or it might be sort of protectionism that a government wants to give to their industry. But what I want to say is, in a sense, you will see many such things happening in the future, because as of now, most of the global providers are from mostly US. But what you would see changing is, you would see a lot of players coming out of Europe and other countries and serving the global customer base. So probably fintech could be a game changer. Excuse me. Fintech could be a game changer, because here the company or the service provider could be anywhere. It's not just limited to one country or one region. So yes, it could change the global game. And just like Jennifer mentioned, I mean, there are a lot of other industries who are playing the role of financial organizations now by giving loans, by supporting their supply chain and things like that. So I think you would also see a bigger change globally in terms of the definition itself of who are the financial services providers. So that's something that you could see. Just before I put my views to end, I would just like to highlight this as 6 points in general for fintech. See, the fintech or any other industry looking at digital adoption has to keep in mind this 6-point program. One, the digital transformation is going to be quite rapid. It's going to be more faster than what you can think of. Number 2, it's going to be more complex. So you need to be prepared for that. Number 3, the lack of competencies would be everywhere, not just in cybersecurity. You would find that in most of the fintech related competencies that you would require. Number 4, the awareness. From cybersecurity point of view, regulatory point of view, the lack of awareness is something that you have to deal with internally with your stakeholders as well as the external stakeholders. And number 6, you're not going to be anymore an organization who would be self-sufficient. Most of your core business would also be run by some of your service providers. So you would have a lot of offering within your fintech portfolio which would not be managed and run by you, but would be sort of offering which could come from anywhere. It could be a service provider who is offering that through you as a financial organization. So one of the most important thing is either be it outsourcing or be it using external vendors or using the external services portfolio that you incorporate in your business. It would require a very strong vendor management or service provider management. So the contract management in essence would become very important going forward in any kind of fintech or digital or IT related business.
Thanks a lot, Ahmed. I'm sure you have questions before we round up with a few very succinct takeaways. And we have a mic here. So if you can just introduce yourself. There's a question from... Behind you, you want to ask a question?
Hello. Now, there is always a discussion that the fintech companies and the banks, they are competitors or they can work together. Yeah, now there are many services which traditional bank used to provide, which are now provided by fintech companies. So, what the traditional bank should do now to manage the challenge which is posed by the fintech companies?
Can you hear me? Is my mic back on? So I think in the first wave of fintech, it was very much poised as a threat, us versus them, fintechs versus banks. Are banks going to exist? But I think now there's a much more mature discussion about the resident strengths of each part of that equation. You know, the techs are quite good at creating user experiences and developing quickly and not being very light organizations that can innovate. However, you know, there has been the stakes are very high for those companies now because that does not replace brand, capital strength, regulatory expertise that banks have built over, you know, decades or centuries. And so the thing that's very interesting is really how do you leverage on the fact that you might have an extremely strong brand and capital and resources at your disposal, but maybe you're not a light organization and you should think more carefully about tapping into different outside providers to build a specific part of the customer journey. And that to me has been the real insight over the past 18 months, where it's not us versus them at all. The people that will win are the ones that really have a very honest understanding within their organization of their core competency and then filling the gaps where that does not exist. And to echo one more point, not underestimating the change. Industries, you know, we have hundreds of years of industries that have been disrupted and underestimated how far that change will go. And I think particularly in this digital revolution, we should not underestimate how far consumers will go if given the right tools and their preferences and habits that are formed from other industries. So to me, it's all about like what are your true core strengths as an organization, and then thinking very hard about what the gaps are, and then building a strategy around that.
If I could just add to that, from what I've heard from the various engagement with fintech players as well as banks, most banks now are starting to think about having a kind of innovation strategy internally. And they are typically driven by two factors, and one is about the consumer experience. At the end, if we think that we want to retain market share, we want to have maintain a very good consumer experience in terms of the usage of your services, that's from a business perspective that it makes sense for the organization to develop some kind of an innovation strategy to serve that segment of stakeholders. The other wave of concentration is probably less pleasant, and that is the risk of being disrupted such that you no longer have the business or revenue in that business segment is affected terribly. So you can either be disrupted, which is very uncomfortable, or you can choose to embrace change now, which is also uncomfortable, but at least you steer your own destiny. Most banks have the tendency to rush into it without developing a proper integrated holistic innovation strategy. And my take is banks should not rush into it. They must ask themselves why they are doing this and for good reasons. All over the world, there are lots of examples of how banks partner with the fintech community, from open source innovation to buying into or investing, setting up corporate venture companies to invest into such companies, or just partnering on developing a certain product and services. So there are various spectrums for the banks to think about, but I think internally the bank has to be clear why are they doing this, and then from there it becomes a more sustainable approach as opposed to kind of react and then dive into it to realize that it's the wrong path.
I see another question over there. You can be brief. Sorry.
Yes, very brief. Mr. Wailum, this is directed at you. You mentioned a fintech regulatory structure. Can you please give us what are the primary goals that this regulatory structure aims to achieve, and a couple of actual examples of regulation that would achieve these goals?
Okay. It all started with the philosophy of us wanting to embrace innovation. All right. So what are the objectives that we hope to achieve with this regulatory framework, which we call the RegLab? Now, first and foremost, we all recognize that in this digital world, the rules are somewhat outdated. Right? So one of the objectives is through this platform, we hope to update our rules so that they are relevant and are able to support the needs of the digital economy. The second objective is really that we think that if we don't do it here, the talent will just flow overseas. Right? They will just go there are so many places in the world that they can explore, China, US, to deploy their innovation. So to us, it's a loss if we lose all this talent because they really don't have a playground or platform for them to test and develop their idea. And the third is, we at the end of the day, fintech or innovation promotes the development of the financial services sector as a whole, right? If we have a regulatory regime that is so tough that innovation can never thrive, and there are no new ideas, no innovation, no services, I think it will be a loss because essentially we are not progressing, right? So objectives that we set out to establish so-called embodied in this RegLab. Right? Some of the rules that we have put in place would be, like I say, we adopt a blank sheet approach. We assume that you have no risk or no rules that need to be applied. But let's take an example of a robo-advisor coming in, right? Say these robo-advisors are targeting only or testing their product with their family friends, right? For us, that risk is limited because you're talking about testing your idea with friends you're familiar with or people who are prepared to come on board to test your solution. So in a way, that clientele reach, that clientele sophistication, the risk of misconduct is lowered because if anything goes wrong, at least it is your friends and families that have so-called trusted you to test the solution with them. So for that scenario, we might not require a kind of suitability test. And then from the AML perspective, if you are saying that all your friends and family members have an existing bank account which is subject to tough AML rules and regulations, and when you move funds from these banks to these startups to test your investments, I can take a risk-based approach to doing this. I may not subject you to the full AML suite of requirements because the funds that you are coming in or you're taking in is from a trusted source that has gone through the stringent requirements of AML testing. So just on that tool, I can say I will apply I probably may disapply the suitability test for you, and the AML test, I would say that you may not need to adopt such a strict due diligence process for your individuals. So those are just some examples that we can think of.
One very last question, if there is any. Yes?
Thank you. It's just a quick one, linking a bit with what Mr. Wailum was saying before about financial institutions rushing to embrace new technology. I wonder if there is no lack of policy restricting, the usage of technology. Well, not explicitly restricting, but somehow defining, the rights of consumers and the rights of, the users to avoid that rush, in financial services and in any other industry, because that's a bit the problem with technology these days. That's my question. Thank you.
Does anybody want to take this one? Jennifer.
I will try to take that one. I think that the challenge is innovation is very hard to control the speed of innovation. And our digital habits are such that we are clicking accept terms at a very high rate across all parts of our digital life. And the real core question in that is, do the consumers understand what they're checking and how is my data being used, and is that being used in a secure and proper way? And this is really, it is, again, not to overuse the word, but it is about collaborating across a proper regulatory framework to execute that, the internal protocols around that. It is very much a business challenge, not a technical challenge, on having a very holistic approach to protecting your customers. However, I don't think we will be able to control the entire perimeter. And that is it will, I think, in the next few years, there'll be conference after conference after conference talking about that complexity. Because it is, many different industries, many different providers, blurring the lines between how personal data is stored, used, shared, repurposed, analyzed. And that's a pretty big moving target right now. So it may not be a satisfying answer, but it is, I think, very much the state of things right now.
Yeah, and Olga.
Hi. So at the end of the day, every consumer, every person is owner of its own data. And the way in which the industry and the vendors, providers, companies deal with that data need to be subject to the permissions that the consumer gives. And our point of view is that the consumer will have a discretionary and very detailed definitions of what they will allow or not. Companies need to be able to accept and manage those restrictions. For example, I will give you permission to access my, to apply insights on my data as long as you anonymize it. Or I will give you permission to contact me in this context for this product through this channel at this time. So it's not going to be just a blanket statement, I give you permission or not. I'm going to be very discretionary about where I give you permission for what and in what context. And if companies are not allowed to have that framework that allows that, those details, they're going to start, have restrictions on the use. That's at least the way in which we are seeing about private and personal information.
Ahmed, the last word on privacy and security.
I think one of the most important things is when companies are collecting data, they have to be explicit in terms of stating what is the purpose of collection of data, how are they going to process the data. It has to be a fair use of data. And the most important thing which would probably also be enforced by regulatory framework is the right to forget. Let's say you are a customer of a particular bank for X amount of time, or you are using a particular service for Y amount of time. You should have an option where you could tell them to wipe out your data if you're no more their customer. Of course, in banking, it might have its own regulatory restrictions because you have to retain the data for a specific amount of time. But then, after that compliance is met, there has to be a way where the company proves that the data has been erased. And trust me, the GDPR would make this as the biggest challenge for the bank, because when I was discussing this with a couple of CISOs, they said that we have data for last 15 to 20 years. And now we are supposed to go and find out where the PII data resides, and we are supposed to wipe the data out and prove that it's been wiped out. So it's going to be a tough challenge, but probably as we go on, I think there'll be a fair balance in the usage. I completely agree with what she said, that as far as you do analysis, like a lot of people want to use the data for doing analysis, predictive analysis, or whatever analysis you want to do. But the data has to make sure that people's, number one, free will is not compromised, and it has to be, the pseudonymization of data is very important, because till such time you don't link it back to an individual, I think it's fair to use the data for analysis.
Thanks, Ahmed. Before you exercise your right to forget, just 3 very simple takeaways, at least those that I got from here, that I'm bringing home. The first, very simple, but I guess it's good to make a simple, to remember simple things is much more easier than the difficult ones. No, so the first one is obviously that fintech is here to stay, that there's no way to resist, and this applies to regulators, to financial market participants, and also to customers, because do not forget that many customers tend to resist innovation, of course, and in fact there are huge opportunities in some markets, and India was not mentioned as such, but Ahmed was telling me that in India still 80% of the population is not connected to the internet, so just think of the huge opportunities.
Mobile internet.
Mobile included, and obviously this means that, as we heard from Olga, in the case of Kenya, there are huge opportunities out there. The second point is that obviously there are always, and in this particular case, huge risks and huge challenges ahead. And again, they have to do with security, with privacy, with consumer protection, with competition policy, obviously, because it's true that the barriers are lower, but still they are there. The third challenge, which is related, I guess, which is very crucial, is the one of collaboration and dialogue. And again, the experience of Abu Dhabi, but also the previous experience of Singapore, which was mentioned, is very interesting from this point of view. And as Jennifer mentioned, there will be zillions of conferences discussing this. But of course, talk is cheap, but it's also necessary and not only sufficient, but definitely necessary to improve the ecosystem for financial innovation in fintech. The fourth takeaway that I take personally is that fintech has made many advances, but that noise reduction technology is not keeping abreast, and that it was really, really noisy. So thanks a lot for being here, and let me join me in applauding our panelists for their work. Thank you very much.